I'm Jeremy, 38 male. I'm a project manager living in the city with my 8-year-old son, Ethan. For the past 5 years, it's just been the two of us, navigating a world that was fractured by a fire that took my wife and left my son with scars that tell a story he was too young to remember. This is the story of how those very scars, the source of his deepest pain, unexpectedly connected us to the one person in the world who understood their origin, forcing two broken families to confront a shared past and build an unforeseen future. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. 5 years, for half a decade, the ghost of fire had been the third member of our family. It was a silent, shapeless presence that lived in the silvered, ropey patterns on my son Ethan's arms and shoulder. It was in the quiet moments when he'd trace them with a small finger, his expression a mixture of curiosity and a sadness he couldn't name. He was only 3 when it happened. Too young to remember the smoke, the heat, or the face of his mother, Hannah, who never made it out of our apartment. But his body remembered. His scars were a permanent map of a tragedy that had redefined our lives. Now at 8 years old, Ethan was a marvel of resilience. He was a bright, thoughtful boy who could spend hours constructing intricate Lego castles or explaining the anatomical differences between a velociraptor and a Deinonychus with the seriousness of a seasoned paleontologist. He had a laugh that could fill a room and a heart that was far too gentle for the world. Most days, he wore his scars with an unthinking acceptance that I, his father, could only envy. I, on the other hand, saw them and felt the phantom heat, heard the distant sirens, and felt the raw, gaping hole Hannah's absence had left behind. We had just moved across town. I'd received a significant promotion at the engineering firm where I worked as a project manager. The new role meant more responsibility and a much longer commute, but it also came with a salary that could give Ethan opportunities I never had. The biggest selling point, however, was the school district. Northwood Elementary was lauded for its resources, its stellar test scores, and its progressive, inclusive environment. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a place where Ethan could thrive without the baggage of our old neighborhood, where everyone knew our story and looked at him with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. I had hoped the new school would be a sanctuary. I had envisioned him making friends easily, his love for dinosaurs and building blocks eclipsing the visible marks on his skin. I had painted a mental picture of him running on the playground, his laughter mingling with that of other children, completely unburdened. But childhood is a far crueler landscape than a parent's hopeful imagination. The cruelty didn't start with a bang, it began with a whisper. It was in the subtle shifts of other children in the cafeteria line, a small, almost imperceptible widening of the space around him. It was in the lingering stares that followed him down the hallway, eyes tracing the journey of his scars from his short-sleeved shirts to the back of his neck. It was in the playground groups that would suddenly fall silent when he approached, only to resume their chatter once he had passed. Ethan, with his sensitive soul, noticed everything. He didn't complain at first, but I saw the change in him. The vibrant light in his eyes dimmed a little each afternoon he came home. He became quieter, more withdrawn, preferring the company of his Lego bin to the prospect of telling me about his day. I tried to draw him out gently. "How was school today, buddy?" I'd ask while making dinner, my voice deliberately casual. "Fine," he'd reply, his focus locked on the plastic bricks in his hands. "Make any new friends?" A shrug, "Not really." I told myself it was just an adjustment period. New school, new faces, it was natural for a shy kid to take some time to warm up. I packed his favorite snacks in his lunchbox, bought him a new dinosaur t-shirt he'd been eyeing, and reminded him every morning how smart, kind, and wonderful he was. I was his father. It was my job to be his shield, his advocate, and his cheerleader. But I was beginning to fear that my love was not enough to protect him from the casual barbarism of the schoolyard. The first real alarm bell rang about a month into the school year. I was tucking him into bed when he asked a question that felt like a shard of ice in my chest. "Dad," he said, his voice small in the dim light of his dinosaur-shaped nightlight, "do my arms look scary?" I sat on the edge of his bed, my heart aching. "Scary? Of course not, bud. Why would you ask that?" He looked down at his arms, tucked under the cov. A kid at school said they look like a melted monster." Rage, pure and primal, surged through me. It was a cold, venomous thing that I had to physically restrain. I took a deep breath, forcing my face to remain calm and reassuring. "Well, that kid is wrong," I said, my voice softer than I felt. "Your arms don't look scary. They look like a survivor's arms. They tell a story about how brave you were when you were very little. They're like a superhero's battle scars." He seemed to consider this for a moment, like Captain America. Exactly like Captain America, I confirmed, managing a small smile. Proof that you're stronger than you think. He seemed satisfied with that answer and he drifted off to sleep a few minutes later. But I lay awake for hours, the image of some faceless child calling my son a monster replaying in my mind. I knew then that this was more than just a quiet adjustment period. This was the beginning of a battle, and I had no idea how fiercely it would need to be fought. I resolved to speak with his teacher to nip this in the bud before it could grow into something uglier. I was naive. I thought a simple conversation would be enough. I didn't yet understand that the seeds of this cruelty had been planted in soil far deeper and more troubled than I could ever imagine, and that they were already starting to sprout. My conversation with Ethan's teacher, a woman named Mrs. Alvarez, was disappointing in its predictability. She was kind, her face a mask of practiced sympathy as I sat on a comically small chair in her brightly colored classroom. She listened patiently as I explained the melted monster comment, her brow furrowed with concern. "I'm so sorry to hear that, Mr. Walsh," she said, her hands clasped on her desk. "Children can be so thoughtless at this age. Do you know which student said this?" Ethan wouldn't tell me, I admitted. He was more hurt by the words than interested in naming the person. "I understand," she nodded. "I'll keep a closer eye on the classroom dynamics. I'll also make a point to have a general talk with the class about kindness and how everyone is different. We have a zero-tolerance policy for bullying here at Northwood." I left the meeting feeling slightly mollified, clinging to the phrase zero tolerance. It sounded definitive, strong. It suggested action and consequences, but the words were a hollow shield. The general talk about kindness, if it ever happened, had no effect. The whispers didn't stop. They found a leader. A boy named Tyler Thompson appointed himself the chief tormentor, and with his leadership, the subtle ostracism evolved into overt, targeted cruelty. The name Tyler started to surface in Ethan's reluctant evening reports. Tyler said I couldn't play tag because I might be contagious. Tyler told everyone my dad must be a monster too. Each sentence was a fresh stab, and my son was retreating further into himself. He started having nightmares again, waking up crying in the middle of the night, something that hadn't happened since the early years after the fire. He'd cling to me, his small body trembling, and I'd hold him until he fell back into a troubled sleep, my own mind racing with a helpless fury. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening. I was helping him with his math homework when he looked up from his worksheet, his eyes glassy with unshed tears. "Dad," he began, his voice trembling, "am I the reason Mom died?" The world stopped, the pen in my hand clattered to the table. "What? Ethan, no, why would you ever think that?" "Tyler said it," he whispered, a tear finally escaping and tracing a path through the faint smudge of pencil dust on his cheek. "He said my mom died because she couldn't live with a monster. He said that's why normal families don't have kids like me." The rage I had felt before was a flickering candle compared to the inferno that now consumed me. This wasn't thoughtless childhood teasing. This was psychological warfare waged against an 8-year-old. Tyler Thompson wasn't just being mean, he was taking the single greatest trauma of my son's life and twisting it into a weapon to destroy his spirit. I knelt in front of Ethan, taking his small hands in mine. "Ethan, you listen to me very carefully," I said, my voice shaking with the effort of keeping it steady. "You are not a monster. You are the best thing that has ever happened to me. Your mother loved you more than anything in this entire world, and she would be so incredibly proud of the brave, kind, smart boy you've become. What that kid is saying is a lie. It's an ugly, stupid lie, and it has nothing to do with you or your mom." My words were a temporary balm, but they couldn't erase the poison that had already seeped in. The next morning, Ethan begged me not to make him go to school. He clung to my leg, sobbing, saying he felt sick. My heart shattered. The school that was supposed to be his sanctuary had become his prison.
Oh dear.
That day, I bypassed the teacher and scheduled a meeting with the principal, Dr. Norris. She was a polished woman who spoke in a smooth, administrative dialect filled with buzzwords like restorative justice, peer mediation, and socio-emotional learning. She listened to my story, her expression one of deep professional gravity. "This is a very serious allegation, Mr. Walsh," she said, typing notes into her computer. "Tyler Thompson's behavior is completely unacceptable and does not reflect the values of our school community." "So what are you going to do about it?" I demanded, my patience worn thin. "My son is being emotionally tormented. He's afraid to come to school." "We are implementing a comprehensive anti-bullying framework," she explained, her gaze fixed on her monitor. "Tyler will be required to participate in counseling sessions with our school psychologist. We will also facilitate a mediated conversation between him and Ethan in a safe and structured environment to foster understanding." A conversation, I asked, incredulous. You want my son, the victim, to sit down with his bully to foster understanding? He's 8, he needs to feel safe, he needs the bullying to stop. Now. I understand your urgency, she said, her tone never wavering from its calm, detached professionalism. And we are taking proactive steps. We're even planning a school-wide assembly on the theme of inclusion next month. I left her office feeling utterly defeated. The school wasn't a shield, it was a bureaucracy. It responded to trauma with paperwork, action plans, and assemblies scheduled for weeks in the future. They were more concerned with following their protocol than with protecting my child. The system I had trusted, the one I had uprooted our lives for, was failing. It was a profound and bitter betrayal, not just by a cruel little boy, but by the very adults who were supposed to protect him. The school wouldn't act, so I would have to. I just didn't know how yet. The weeks that followed the meeting with Dr. Norris were a study in institutional inertia. The promised proactive steps were invisible. The bullying continued, and if anything, Tyler seemed emboldened. With no immediate and tangible consequences for his actions, he likely interpreted the school's response as a sign of his own power. Ethan's mornings became a daily struggle, a tearful negotiation to get him out of bed and into the car. His joy, once so readily available, was now a rare and precious commodity. He stopped talking about dinosaurs. His Lego castle sat half-finished in his room, gathering dust. He was fading before my eyes. I documented every incident. I sent emails to Mrs. Alvarez and Dr. Norris, creating a digital paper trail of their inaction. Their replies were always prompt, polite, and utterly useless, filled with assurances that the process was ongoing and that these things take time. Time was something Ethan didn't have. With every passing day, a little more of his childhood was being stolen. The final straw wasn't a verbal assault. It was an act of physical destruction that symbolized the entire campaign against him. It was a Thursday afternoon. I was waiting in the car line to pick him up, and I saw him walking towards the car, his head down, his shoulders slumped. He climbed into the passenger seat without a word. It was only when I pulled away from the curb that I noticed it. He was wearing his favorite t-shirt, a bright blue one with a meticulously detailed T-Rex skeleton on the front. Or rather, he was wearing what was left of it. A huge, jagged tear ran down the front, right through the dinosaur's rib cage. "Ethan, what happened to your shirt?" I asked, my voice tight. He wouldn't look at me, he just picked at the torn fabric, his lower lip trembling. "It was at recess," he mumbled. "Tyler grabbed it, he said monsters don't get to have nice things." That was it, the dam of my restraint, which had been cracking for weeks, finally burst. It wasn't just a shirt, it was his favorite thing. It was a small piece of joy that a bully had decided he didn't deserve. In that moment, I saw the ripped fabric as a metaphor for my son's spirit, torn apart by senseless cruelty while the people in charge stood by and talked about frameworks and assemblies. That night after Ethan was asleep, I sat in the dark of our living room, the torn shirt clutched in my hand. The quiet fury that had been simmering inside me boiled over into a cold, hard resolve. The school had failed. Their processes, their protocols, their professional detachment, it was all a useless charade. They were not going to protect my son, so I was done with emails and meetings. I was done waiting for a system to do its job. It was time for a more direct approach. I was going to find Tyler Thompson's father and have a conversation he couldn't ignore. Finding the address was surprisingly easy. The school in one of its few moments of util. ID provided a directory for parents to arrange playdates and carpools. The Thompsons lived about 15 minutes away, in a neighborhood that was a few rungs down the socioeconomic ladder from our new one. I spent the next day, Friday, wrestling with what I would say, how I would approach it. My mind cycled through a dozen scenarios, from a calm, rational discussion to a shouting match on his front porch. By Saturday morning, I still didn't have a script, only a raw, unyielding determination. I drove over around 10 o'clock. The house was a modest, single-story ranch, the kind built in the thousands after the war. The yard was patchy and overgrown in places, and the beige paint on the house was starting to peel near the gutters. A heavy-duty pickup truck was parked in the driveway, and through the open garage door, I could see an old motorcycle covered with a dusty tarp. The whole place had an air of neglect, as if the person living there was too tired or too overwhelmed to keep up with the small details of maintenance. My heart pounded in my chest as I walked up the cracked concrete path to the front door. I was a bundle of nerves and righteous anger. I was a father on a mission, fueled by a love so fierce it felt like it could burn through steel. I took a deep, steadying breath and knocked, the sound echoing louder than I expected in the quiet morning air. I rehearsed my opening line in my head: "Your son has been tormenting my child and it needs to stop." I was ready for denial. I was ready for a confrontation. I was ready for anything, or so I thought. The man who answered the door was not what I had pictured. I had imagined someone loud, aggressive, maybe a reflection of the son he was raising. But the man standing before me looked broken. He was tall and lean, probably in his early 40s, with salt and pepper hair that was messy as if he'd just run his hands through it 100 times. But it was his eyes that struck me. They were tired, profoundly so, shadowed with a weariness that went far beyond lack of sleep. There were faint, silvery scars on the backs of his hands and along his forearms, and he moved with a slight stiffness, a careful deliberation that suggested old injuries. "Can I help you?" he asked. His voice was gravelly but not unfriendly, laced with a note of caution. "Are you Tyler Thompson's father?" I asked, my own voice firmer than I felt. A flicker of something, recognition, resignation, passed through his tired eyes. He seemed to shrink a little, his shoulders sagging. "I am," he said. "He didn't ask who I was. He didn't have to. I think I know why you're here." The man, Gene Thompson, stepped back from the doorway, holding the door open in a gesture of weary invitation. "You should probably come in," he said, his voice flat. It wasn't the aggressive confrontation I had braced myself for. There was no denial, no blustering defense of his son. There was only a profound sense of exhaustion, as if my presence on his doorstep was just one more burden in a life already overloaded with them. I stepped inside. The house was tidy but stark. The furniture was functional and sparse, chosen for utility rather than comfort. It felt like a temporary living space, not a home filled with warmth and memories. On the mantelpiece above an unused fireplace, a few framed photos were arranged. I glanced at them as I walked further into the room. In the older photos, a smiling woman stood next to Jean and a much younger Tyler. In the more recent ones, she was gone. It was just father and son, their smiles looking forced and thin. "Want some coffee?" Jean offered, gesturing toward a small kitchen off the living room. "I just made a pot." "This isn't a friendly visit," I said, my anger, which had momentarily subsided in the face of his weary demeanor, flaring up again. I needed him to understand the gravity of the situation, the firestorm his son had ignited in my family's life. "Your son has been systematically bullying my son for months. He is making his life a living nightmare, and frankly, the school has been completely useless." Jean's shoulders slumped even further. He leaned against the doorframe to the kitchen, looking older than he had a moment ago. "I know," he said, his voice quiet. "I know he's been acting out. I've been trying to talk to him, to work with him on his anger, but he's going through a lot right now. We both are." "A rough patch," I shot back, my voice rising despite my efforts to control it. "A rough patch doesn't give him a license to psychologically torture another child. Do you have any idea the things he's been saying? He calls my son a monster because of the scars on his arms. He told my son that his mother died because she couldn't stand to look at him." The color drained from Jean's face. He physically recoiled as if I had struck him. "He said what?" he stammered. "You heard me," I pressed on, relentless. "Your son is methodically destroying an 8-year old self-worth. He's taking a boy who has already been through an unspeakable tragedy and is piling on more pain." Jean ran a hand through his hair, his expression a mixture of horror and disbelief. "I had no idea, Mr. Walsh, Jeremy Walsh." "Mr. Walsh, I am so sorry. The teacher just told me there were some behavioral issues. She said he was being unkind to another student. She never said this." He shook his head, looking genuinely appalled. "This is beyond unacceptable. I will handle this. I promise you I will deal with Tyler right away." "It's gone way past just dealing with Tyler," I said, the tremor in my voice betraying my own pain. "My son is having nightmares again. He's scared to go to school. This morning he asked me if he was the reason his mother died. Your son did that." Jean seemed to fixate on one detail. "Scars?" he asked suddenly, his voice taking on a strange, focused intensity. "You mentioned scars. What kind of scars are they?" The question was so unexpected it threw me off balance. "What difference does it make?" I asked, suspicious. "Please," he said, and there was a raw desperation in his tone that cut through my anger. I need to know." Something in his haunted eyes, in the sheer urgency of his plea, made me pause. It wasn't idle curiosity. This was something else. Against my better judgment, I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the photos until I found a recent one from a trip to the beach we'd taken over the summer. In the photo, Ethan was smiling, holding up a seashell, wearing swim trunks and nothing else. The scars were starkly visible. A sprawling network of silver and pink tissue covering his left shoulder and wrapping around his arm and part of his chest. I held the phone out to Jean's. He took it, his hand trembling slightly. He stared at the image on the small screen for a long, silent moment. I watched as his face went from pale to ashen. His breathing grew shallow. He looked from the photo to me and back again, his eyes wide with a dawning horror that I couldn't comprehend. "Oh my God," he whispered, the words barely audible. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a pain so profound it seemed to emanate from him in waves. "I know those scars." The air in the room grew thick and heavy. A cold dread, sharp and inexplicable, trickled down my spine. "What do you mean you know them?" I demanded, my voice a hoarse whisper. "That's impossible." He didn't seem to hear me. He continued to stare at my son's picture, a terrible recognition settling over him. He finally looked up, his gaze locking with mine. "Mr. Walsh," he said, his voice trembling, "what was your wife's name?" The question was a lightning strike, a complete non sequitur that made no sense. "Hannah," I answered automatically. "Why?" "And the fire," he continued, his voice cracking. "It was 5 years ago, wasn't it? An apartment building on George Street." Every nerve in my body went rigid. The blood in my veins turned to ice. Those were details I hadn't shared, details no stranger could possibly know. "How do you know that?" Gene Thompson finally collapsed into a nearby armchair, the phone slipping from his grasp onto the cushion. He buried his face in his scarred hands, his body racked with a silent, shuddering sob. "Because I was there," he choked out, his voice muffled by his hands. "I was the firefighter who pulled your son out of that building." The world tilted on its axis. The sparse living room, the tired man in the armchair, the very air I was breathing, it all seemed to warp and distort. His words echoed in the sudden, ringing silence of my mind. "I was the firefighter who pulled your son out." It was an impossible coincidence, a cruel twist of fate so absurd it felt like a line from a bad movie. I stared at him, my mind scrambling to connect the dots, to process a truth that felt fundamentally unbelievable. "That's not possible," I finally managed to say, the words feeling clumsy and foreign in my mouth. "The firefighter who saved Ethan, his name was Thompson, I remember that much, but his first name was Eugene." The man in the chair looked up, his face pale and streaked with tears. "Eugene is my full name," he said quietly. "Everyone just calls me Gene." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place, and the full weight of the revelation crashed down on me. I felt a wave of nausea, and I had to brace myself against the wall to keep from stumbling. This man, the father of the boy who was tormenting my son, was the very same man I had hailed as a hero for the past 5 years. He was the nameless, faceless figure who had run into a burning building and emerged with my 3-year-old child in his arms. He had saved Ethan. But he hadn't been able to save Hannah. The silence stretched between us, thick with the ghosts of the past. I looked at him, truly looked at him, and suddenly everything made a terrible kind of sense. The profound weariness in his eyes, the slight pained stiffness in his movements, the scars on his hands, and the missing wife in the family photos. "You were hurt," I said, the words coming out as a statement, not a question. I was remembering the snippets of information I'd been given in the chaotic aftermath of the fire. The fire chief had told me the man who rescued Ethan had been injured when a section of the ceiling gave way. Gene nodded slowly. He pulled up the sleeve of his flannel shirt, revealing a more extensive, puckered landscape of burn scars that snaked up his forearm. "Crushed my left shoulder," he said, his voice detached, as if he were reciting a technical report. "Broke 3 ribs, second-degree burns across my arms and back, but that wasn't the worst part." "What was the worst part?" I asked, my anger completely gone, replaced by a deep, aching sense of shared history. He met my gaze, and his eyes were raw with a 5-year-old agony. "The worst part," he said, his voice breaking, "was that I only had time to make one trip up those stairs before the whole structure became unstable. I had to make a choice. I could get to your son who was crying in his crib, or I could try to get to your wife who was in the other room. I couldn't do both." Tears began to well in my own eyes, but they were no longer tears of rage. They were tears of a grief I had carried alone for so long, now suddenly shared with the unlikeliest of companions. This man had not only witnessed my greatest tragedy, he had been a central actor in it. He had carried a burden of his own from that day, a weight I had never even considered. "You saved my son," I said, the words thick with emotion. "But I couldn't save your wife," he whispered, the guilt pouring out of him like a poison. "I have lived with that every single day for 5 years, the knowledge that I chose. And because of my choice, a woman died and a little boy grew up without his mother." I crossed the room and stood before him. "Gene," I said, and my voice was surprisingly steady, "you didn't make a choice. You made the only choice anyone could have made. You saved a 3-year-old child." "But your wife—" "The fire chief told me afterward," I interrupted gently. "Hannah was already unconscious from smoke inhalation when you arrived. He said she likely wouldn't have survived even if you had reached her first. But Ethan was still awake. He was still fighting. You saved the one person who could be saved. Gene looked up at me, his expression one of stunned disbelief. You don't blame me. Blame you? I let out a short, hollow laugh. Gene, for 5 years, I have been profoundly grateful to a man named Eugene Thompson who risked his own life for my son. I never, in my wildest dreams, imagined I would ever get the chance to thank him face to face. We sat in a heavy silence for a moment, the two of us, strangers bound by a single catastrophic event, processing the impossible odds that had brought us to this living room. Is that why you left the fire department? I asked softly. He nodded. The physical injuries healed for the most part, but the other stuff, the stuff in my head, it didn't. I started having panic attacks every time I heard a siren, started drinking too much to quiet the memories. I couldn't do the job anymore. I couldn't be trusted to make those life-or-death calls. He gestured vaguely at the empty space on the mantel where a woman's picture used to be. My wife left 2 years ago, said she couldn't be married to a ghost. His voice was laced with a bitterness that was clearly aimed at himself. Tyler blames me for her leaving. He's been an angry kid ever since, picking fights, acting out. I've been trying to get him help, trying to help myself, but most days it feels like I'm drowning. So there it was, a direct line from the fire 5 years ago to the torn t-shirt in my car. Tyler's cruelty wasn't born of simple malice. It was the misdirected rage of a boy who had lost his mother and was watching his father crumble. He was lashing out at the world, and Ethan, with his visible scars, had become the unfortunate target. Mr. Walsh, Jeremy, Gene said, his face etched with a fresh wave of remorse. I am so sorry for all of it, for what Tyler did, for not being able to save Hannah, for all the pain you and your son have had to carry. I put a hand on his shoulder. It was a strange, impulsive gesture, but it felt right. You have nothing to apologize for, Gene. You are a hero. You saved my son and you almost died doing it. That is the only thing that matters. I paused. But there's one problem. Tyler doesn't know any of this, does he? He just sees a boy with scars and uses it as a weapon. No, Gene said quietly. He doesn't know. I've never told him the details of that day. Then maybe, I said, a new idea beginning to form, a plan that felt both terrifying and necessary. It's time you did. Gene looked at me, a flicker of uncertainty in his eye. But it was quickly replaced by a look of resolve. He nodded slowly, a grim determination settling on his features. You're right, he said, his voice firmer than it had been all morning. He needs to understand, he needs to know what real strength looks like, and he needs to face the consequences of his own actions. He took a deep breath. He's in his room, grounded for getting into a shoving match at school yesterday. He stood up, his movements still careful but now imbued with a sense of purpose. Would you be willing to stay while I talk to him? He asked, his gaze meeting mine directly. I think he needs to hear this story, and I think he needs to understand who he's been hurting. Ethan's at his grandmother's house today, I said. That's probably for the best, Gene replied. This conversation needs to happen first. Then if it's okay with you, we can figure out a way for the boys to meet properly. Okay, I agreed, my heart pounding. We were venturing into uncharted territory, attempting to heal a wound by exposing its deepest, most painful roots. Gene walked to the bottom of a short hallway and called out, Tyler, get out here, please. A few moments later, a boy with dark, unruly hair and a sullen expression trudged into the living room. He was the spitting image of his father, but where Gene's eyes held a deep, weary sadness, Tyler's held a simmering, defensive anger. He saw me standing near the fireplace and his expression immediately hardened. I didn't do anything, he mumbled, directing the words at the floor. Son, sit down, Gene said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He pointed to the small sofa opposite the armchair where I stood. This is Mr. Walsh, he's Ethan's dad. Tyler shot a venomous glare in my direction before flopping onto the couch, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He was a fortress of adolescent defiance. For the next hour, I stood by and witnessed one of the most difficult and courageous conversations I have ever seen. Gene sat down next to his son, not as an accuser but as a storyteller. He started not with Tyler's bullying but with his own life. He told Tyler about what it was like to be a firefighter, the pride he took in his job, the sense of purpose it gave him. He spoke of the brotherhood, the training, and the oath they all took to protect people, no matter the cost. Then, his voice growing softer, he began to tell the story of one particular fire. He described the call coming in, the race to the scene, the smoke pouring from the third-story window of an apartment building. He explained how he had geared up, how he had run into the building while others were running out. He told Tyler about the heat, the suffocating smoke, and the terrifying sound of the building groaning around him. Tyler's defensive posture began to soften. He was listening, his eyes wide, captivated by his father's account. This was a side of his dad he had clearly never seen before. I found a little boy, Gene said, his voice thick with emotion. He was only 3 years old and he was all alone in his crib crying. I knew I had to get him out, but the fire was spreading fast and the building was falling apart. I knew I only had time for one trip. He paused, taking a shaky breath before delivering the final, crucial part of the story. That little boy I carried out of the fire, Tyler, that was Ethan, the boy from your class, the boy you've been hurting. The color drained from Tyler's face. He looked as if he had been physically struck. Ethan, he whispered, the name barely audible, but his arms. His scars are from that fire, Jean explained gently but firmly. They are proof that he survived something that should have killed him. They are proof that he is one of the bravest people I have ever met. And you, he said, his voice dropping to an intense, quiet register, you called him a monster for it. The full weight of his actions seemed to land on Tyler all at once. The anger in his eyes dissolved, replaced by a dawning horror and then a deep, gut-wrenching shame. His face crumpled. A tear rolled down his cheek, then another. He began to sob, not the petulant cries of a child who's been caught, but the deep, painful sobs of someone who has just understood the true magnitude of the cruelty they have inflicted. I'm sorry, he choked out between sobs, burying his face in his hands. I'm so sorry, I didn't know. Gene pulled his son into a fierce hug, holding him as he cried. I know you didn't, son, he said, his own voice thick with unshed tears. But that's not an excuse. We don't get to be cruel to people just because we don't understand their story. We have to be better than that. After a few minutes, Tyler pulled away, his face red and blotchy. He looked from his dad to me, his eyes filled with a desperate, sincere remorse. Can I tell him I'm sorry? He asked. I finally spoke, my own voice hoarse with emotion. And Tyler, I think Ethan would appreciate that very much. But I think what he'd like even more than an apology is a friend. Someone who doesn't see his scars but sees him, a really smart, kind boy who loves dinosaurs and Legos. A flicker of hope ignited in Tyler's tear-filled eyes. He nodded eagerly. I want to be his friend, he said with a conviction that I knew was genuine. I want to make it right. In that moment, watching this broken father and his remorseful son, I realized that our plan wasn't just about stopping the bullying. It was about rebuilding. It was about taking the ashes of a 5-year-old tragedy and seeing if together we could find a way to build something new. Arranging the meeting felt like orchestrating a delicate peace treaty. Jean and I spoke on the phone that Sunday, and we decided the best place would be on neutral ground, right before school on Monday morning. It had to be immediate, a direct follow-through on the emotional breakthrough that had happened in Jean's living room. Walking Ethan to school that morning, I felt a knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. I had told him that he was going to get an apology from Tyler, but I didn't explain the full, complicated story behind it. He was nervous, his small hand clutching mine with a desperate grip as we walked through the school gates. What if he's still mean, Dad? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. I don't think he will be, buddy, I said, squeezing his hand reassuringly. But if he is, you come and find me and we'll handle it, I promise. We had just entered the main hallway when I saw them standing near the office. Gene was there, looking more rested than he had on Saturday, and beside him stood Tyler, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his gaze fixed on the scuffed toes of his sneakers. As we approached, Gene gave me a small, encouraging nod. Tyler looked up, his face a mixture of nervousness and resolve. He took a tentative step toward Ethan. Hi, he said softly, I'm Tyler. Ethan looked up at me, his eyes wide with uncertainty, before turning back to Tyler. I'm really sorry, Tyler said, the words rushing out. I was a huge jerk to you. I said horrible things about you and your scars, and it was wrong. I didn't understand. I didn't know that you're a hero. A hero? Ethan asked, his brow furrowed in confusion. Tyler glanced back at his dad, who gave him a supportive nod. My dad told me, he explained to Ethan. He told me about the fire and about how he was the one who saved you. He said your scars aren't ugly. He said they're proof that you're the bravest person he's ever met. Ethan's eyes widened as the pieces began to connect. He slowly turned his gaze from Tyler to Gene, a look of dawning recognition on his face. You're the firefighter, he said, his voice filled with awe. The one who carried me out. Gene knelt, bringing himself down to eye level with my son. His own eyes were glistening with unshed tears. I am, he said, his voice thick. And I've thought about you every day for 5 years, kiddo, wondering if you were okay, if you were happy. I remember someone holding me, Ethan said quietly, his voice distant with the effort of recalling a hazy, dreamlike memory. Someone told me it was going to be okay. Was that you? That was me, Jean confirmed, a single tear finally escaping and tracing a path down his cheek. And you were okay. You were so much more than okay. Tyler stepped forward again, reclaiming Ethan's attention. I was mean because I was mad about other stuff in my life, and I took it out on you because you were different, he said with a maturity that belied his age. It was wrong. Can you forgive me? Ethan was quiet for a long moment. He looked at Tyler, then at Jean, then up at me. I saw him processing, thinking, my dad says forgiveness is something we do for ourselves, not just for the other person, he said thoughtfully. That's right, buddy, I affirmed. He turned back to Tyler. Okay, he said simply. I forgive you, but you have to promise you'll never be mean to anyone else just for looking different. I promise, Tyler said with solemn gravity. He then broke into a hopeful smile. So, can we be friends? My dad said you like Legos. I have the big Millennium Falcon set. For the first time in weeks, I saw a genuine, unadulterated spark of joy light up Ethan's face. You have the Millennium Falcon? He asked, his voice full of excitement. I have a bunch of the dinosaur sets. As the two boys immediately launched into an enthusiastic, rapid-fire conversation about plastic bricks and prehistoric creatures, Jean and I stepped back, giving them space. Thank you, he said to me quietly, for giving my son a chance to make this right, for forgiving me. There's nothing to forgive, Jean, I said. But there is something I want to ask you. Ethan's been struggling. He's been asking more questions about his mom about that day. I think it might help him to hear the story from you, from the person who was there. Jean's expression softened. I would be honored, he said, whenever you think he's ready. How about dinner this Saturday, I offered. You and Tyler can come over, the boys can play, and you and I can talk. That Saturday dinner was the beginning of everything. It was awkward at first, two fractured families trying to piece together a new reality. But watching Ethan and Tyler, who were already interacting with the easy camaraderie of lifelong friends, smoothed over the rough edges. After we ate, while the boys were building an elaborate dinosaur versus starship battle scene on the living room floor, Jean told Ethan the story of that day. He focused on the bravery, the helpers, and how proud he was of the strong boy Ethan had become. At one point, Ethan rolled up his sleeve and looked at his arm. Do my scars look like they did when I was a baby? He asked Jean. Jean looked at them with a gentle, appraising eye. They look like a warrior's scars, he said. They tell the story of a battle you won. From that day on, everything changed. Tyler became Ethan's best friend and staunchest defender at school. Jean and I built an unlikely but powerful friendship, bonded by a shared history no one else could ever understand. He started going to therapy and attending meetings, facing the demons he'd been running from for 5 years. He got a job as a fire safety coordinator for the school district. A year later, our lives were unrecognizable. My quiet, lonely house was now frequently filled with the laughter of two boys. Jean was sober, happy, and a constant presence in our lives. We were a strange, cobbled-together family, forged not by blood but by fire and forgiveness. The scars that had once been the source of so much pain had become the bridge that connected us all. They were a permanent reminder that sometimes, the people who best understand our wounds are the ones who were there when we got them.